Welcome, my name is Avery Peck, and today I'll be explaining the contrast and pivot controls in 3 levels of difficulty. Let's get started. Let me go ahead and pop out our waveform so we can see what's going on a little bit better. So let's come down to these controls, and if you don't see contrast and pivot, make sure you're on the first page of this little toolbar down here. Now, contrast is fairly straightforward. If we bring this up, we can add contrast to a shot. And if we bring contrast down, we can reduce our contrast until eventually everything meets and becomes a uniform gray. Now, a quick trick is if you want to reset a control, you can double click the name of it and that'll bring it back to its default value. First off, what does it mean to add contrast to an image? Well, contrast is just the difference in luminance or brightness between colors. So when we add contrast, what we're really doing is we're making bright things brighter and dark things darker. You can also see that on the waveform here. If I reset this and I bring my contrast up, you can see that highlights are being pushed up and shadows are pushed down. This is why you'll often hear the phrase expanding your contrast, which is just another way to say that you're adding contrast to a shot. Now, if we go in the other direction and we reduce contrast, you can see the opposite happens. That bright values are lowered and dark values are lifted until eventually everything meets in the middle. This is called flattening your contrast. Again, just another way to say that you're reducing contrast in an image. So now we need to figure out what the pivot control does. So you may have noticed that when I take my contrast control up and down, that everything moves around this invisible center line or this midpoint. That midpoint is the pivot. So when I'm adding contrast, anything above the pivot gets pushed up and anything below the pivot gets pushed down. And importantly, no matter what I do on this control, anything that's right at that pivot point stays the same. In other words, the pivot is how we decide where we want to add contrast. So a low pivot is going to expand our contrast from a very low point in the shadows. So as you can see, only the darkest shadows are being pushed down and the rest of the image is being pushed up. And conversely, if we set our pivot really high, now only the brightest highlights are being pushed up and everything else is being pushed down. So we're basically expanding contrast in the highlights. And of course, we can set it somewhere in the middle. Now, typically speaking, you want to set your pivot so that the overall exposure of the shot, and especially the exposure on your subject, is the same as it was before. And there's 2 ways to do this. I think oftentimes you can best do it just by eye, by introducing a little bit of contrast, and then just kind of setting this pivot here. And you can also hit Control D or Command D to toggle your node on and off, so you can get it before and after. And I think that's actually pretty close. You can see that as I add contrast, we do get a punchier image, but the exposure on her face overall is about the same as it was before. The second method is to actually use the scopes. Now, there's a fairly close correlation between these numbers that you see on the side of the scope, these 10-bit values, and the decimal value in the pivot control. Now, they're not exactly the same, but they're pretty close. So if the exposure on our face is, say, around 384 or so, then we can set the pivot to 0.384. And that should be pretty close to correct. And then from there, you can maybe just do a few little tweaks to taste. So to quickly recap, the contrast control allows us to expand or flatten our contrast. And the pivot control decides where we expand or flatten our contrast from. So a low pivot will expand contrast in the shadows. We can expand it in the midtones or in the highlights. And as a general rule of thumb, we want to set our pivot to the same exposure as our subject so that the exposure on our subject doesn't drift or change as we add or reduce contrast. Now let's kick things up a notch because in reality there's quite a bit more to contrast and pivot than meets the eye. So for this next section, take a look at these gray steps here on the side of the waveform and pay attention to what happens. If I take contrast up, you can see that as we would expect, everything is expanded around that pivot point, but our white and our black patches don't actually move. They're not affected by our contrast adjustment. And as things get closer to white and closer to black, they become flattened and kind of compressed. Now, if I take contrast down below 1, you can see that everything is flattened or compressed uniformly. So our white and black patches are now affected, and everything is flattened in a nice linear fashion. So to see exactly what's going on, I'm going to flip over to a grayscale ramp, and this will let us see the exact contrast curves that are being created here on the waveform. So let's bring our contrast up, and you can see that we get this nice S-curve shape. So an S-curve is kind of unique in that it expands contrast around the pivot, okay, around this midpoint, but it gives us this nice roll-off in the highlights and shadows to prevent clipping, which I like to call the shoulder and the toe, although you'll often hear different terms used by different people. Now, if we adjust our pivot, you can see that the shape of this S-curve changes to expand contrast in different tonal regions. So if I bring my pivot up high, you can see that we have a very short shoulder, a very short roll-off in the highlights, and a very broad roll-off in the shadows. And this will allow us to expand contrast in the highlights while still not worrying about clipping anything. And of course, if I bring my pivot low, the opposite is true, where we get a very short roll-off in the shadows, but a very long gradual roll-off in the highlights. Now, something interesting happens when I take contrast in the other direction. So if I take it below 1, you can see that instead of an S-curve, everything is perfectly linear. Now, if we adjust our pivot, you can see that, kind of interestingly, the pivot basically functions like an offset. Now, pivot is still doing what you would expect. So if I set my pivot low and play with my contrast here, you can still see that everything is being expanded around this low point here. Now, one more interesting thing is that we can actually change the behavior of our contrast control inside of our project settings. So if I open up our project settings and head over to General Options and scroll down a little bit, there's a setting called Use S-curve for contrast, and it's going to be enabled by default. If I disable this and click Save, you'll notice that the contrast control is actually linear in both directions, instead of using an S-curve above 1. Now, it's important to note too that this is a project-wide setting. It's a global setting, so you can't adjust this on a per-shot basis. You basically set it for the entire project. So at this point, I'm sure you're asking why, right? Why would I use an S-curve over a linear expansion or vice versa? And what are some of the advantages and disadvantages of both? So for S-curves, the biggest advantage really is this roll-off that we get in the highlights and shadows. This allows us to introduce contrast into a shot without worrying about clipping information. And if we come back to our other shot here, this is particularly useful for shots like this with bright highlights and dark shadows. So turning our contrast up, you can see that we get lots of contrast, but nothing is going beyond our scopes here, right? Nothing is actually being clipped. Now, one of the major disadvantages of an S-curve comes from the fact that it's a non-uniform expansion, basically meaning that it doesn't expand everything the same way across the full tonal range of the shot. We expand contrast around our pivot, but we're actually flattening and reducing contrast in the highlights and shadows. This means, practically speaking, that it kind of messes with the tonality of the image in different ways, particularly if we're adjusting our pivot or using different pivot points for different shots. And we're going to explore that a lot more in the advanced section of the video in just a minute. Now, linear contrast has its own unique set of pros and cons. Linear contrast is what we call a uniform expansion, meaning that it expands contrast across the full tonal range of the shot in a completely consistent, uniform fashion. Basically, in other words, the highlights, midtones, and shadows all receive the exact same amount of contrast. Now, practically speaking, this means a couple of things. For starters, linear contrast is extremely consistent and predictable. It's also pivot agnostic, meaning that if we change our pivot point, the way in which contrast is being expanded doesn't actually change. And again, with an S-curve, when we change our pivot, it changes the fundamental shape of that curve. But with linear contrast, we don't have that problem. So no matter what we set our pivot to, we're actually expanding our contrast in exactly the same way. Now, because of this consistency and uniformity, there are many colorists that believe that linear contrast preserves the original image better. So if I jump back to our original shot, you can see that as I play with my contrast control, that everything is, as we would expect, expanded and flattened in a linear fashion. So all of the lighting ratios that the DP established on set are all essentially preserved, right? The relationship between the highlights, midtones, and shadows remains the same, or everything remains equidistant. The main disadvantage of linear contrast, though, is that we no longer have a roll-off, so it's very easy to clip values, particularly with shots like this, where we have bright highlights and dark shadows. So bringing this around full circle, the question is, when do we reach for one over the other? Now, as a very general rule, I like to use linear contrast whenever possible, and then if I still need to add contrast but things are close to clipping, then I'll reach for an S-curve. And chances are you'll actually be using both inside of the same node tree. So if I close this real quick, a very common strategy is to create a single global S-curve for all of the shots in your project, and then do your balancing and shot matching using linear contrast before that S-curve. To kind of elaborate on what I mean, let's say we have two nodes, and in this first node, this is where we'll do our balancing. And then in the second node, we'll have some kind of display transform. So this is probably something to get us from a log space into, say, Rec 709. Now, usually this transform will contain some kind of S-curve. This could be an S-curve that you draw yourself. This could be, an S-curve that's embedded inside of a LUT if you're using a LUT to do this. Even if you're using a form of color management like color space transform or ACES, all of those will apply their own curve to the footage. But the idea is exactly the same. We have some sort of S-curve as part of our transform, and this S-curve is used for every single shot in the project. So every single shot has the exact same S-curve applied to it. And then when we balance our shots, we use linear contrast. So you can either use contrast and pivot set to linear mode, or you can even use other tools like gain and offset, or even lift and gain, which we'll explore a lot more in just a minute. But the main advantage of this is you get the consistency and uniformity of using linear contrast, but you also get the nice roll-off of an S-curve. All right, so we've made it to the advanced section, and at this point I want to elaborate on some of the discoveries we've made so far, and also talk about a few of the finer points of these controls. So firstly, continuing our discussion of workflow, I mentioned that you can add linear contrast to an image using other controls, and I want to demonstrate that real quick. So if we come over to our grayscale ramp, you'll remember that the contrast control in linear mode, of course, expands or flattens an image linearly, and the pivot control functions the same as an offset. Now, you may already know that the gain and offset wheels can perform the exact same functions. So the gain wheel will expand or flatten an image linearly, and the offset wheel will shift everything up and down, the same as pivot. So what this means is we can use our gain wheel as a contrast control, and then we can use our offset wheel as a pivot, or as I like to think of it, as an exposure control, to make sure that our exposure remains consistent as we add a reduced contrast. Now, to quickly show you what this looks like, if I take my gain up a little bit, we're now adding contrast, and then I can take my offset back down so that the exposure of her face remains consistent. And if I A-B this node, you can see that we've now added a little bit of linear contrast to the image. Now, alternatively, we can also use gain and lift. So gain will scale an image linearly from the white point, and lift will scale it linearly from the black point. And so we can actually get the exact same net result just using a slightly different approach. Although personally, I find that gain and offset is the more intuitive approach. Now, one of the advantages of working this way is that it allows us to keep our contrast control in S-curve mode, which is probably the most convenient way to add an S-curve to an image. I also find that the gain and offset wheels are better for balancing images quickly, particularly if you're using a control panel. The second big claim that I want to elaborate on is the idea that S-curves can mess with the tonality of an image, and I want to show you a few different examples. The first and arguably simplest example is the idea that aggressive S-curves can cause highlights and shadows to sometimes look clipped. So with S-curves, there's a direct give and take relationship with contrast, because as we expand contrast around our pivot, we also have to flatten the extremes of the image more aggressively to prevent clipping. Now, to show you what this looks like visually, let's come back to our original shot here, and I'm going to take my contrast up to something high, like 1.5 or so. Now, if I close this real quick and we kind of zoom into our image here, and I toggle this node on and off, you can see that in the highlights, some of these fine details with her hair, for example, become harder to see, become kind of blown out. And the same is true with the shadows, right? So, little details here, like in her hair, are definitely crushed down and they become harder to see. And the more contrast we add here, so I'm using my control panel, but if I push contrast even harder, this effect becomes more pronounced, right? So now it's very hard to see any detail in these shadows and also in the highlights. Now, this is one of those things that you might actually miss it if you're not paying attention, because technically nothing here is clipped, right? Everything is still within our display range. Nothing's going beyond the scopes. The problem, though, is that there's a direct correlation between detail and contrast. We need contrast in order to see detail. So when we flatten contrast in these areas too aggressively, it becomes harder and harder to see detail and eventually gets to a point where these areas look clipped, even though technically they're not. So for this reason, I think it's important to always be aware of how aggressively you're pushing your S-curves, and personally, I like to use them as sparingly as possible to prevent this problem. Now there's a second example of where S-curves can mess with tonality, and this one is more subtle. It can kind of sneak up on you a little bit if you're not careful. So if you recall from earlier, when we're using S-curves and we change our pivot, the shape of that S-curve fundamentally has to change in order to accommodate that new pivot point. So what this basically means is the exact characteristics of our contrast expansion are constantly changing with pivot. So coming back over to our shot here, what I'm going to do is add a fixed amount of contrast, so say 1.3. And what I'm going to do is only adjust the pivot point. So for this, I'll set the pivot point to say 0.3, and I'll grab a still of that. And then I'll set my pivot to something higher, like 0.6. Okay, so what I want to do here is I want to try and match these images as close as I can and show you the subtle differences in tonality. So let me close my scopes real quick and let me just bring them up here. So there's a couple of ways that we can match these. Because the black points and white points of the two images are fairly similar, I think we need to just do some stuff in the midtones here. So we could try to use like the gamma wheel if we wanted to, and lift maybe. But I think it might actually be easier to just use the curves here. So I'm going to take these midtones up a little bit until the exposure on her face is a close match, and I think that's pretty close. And then I also want to match these shadows here. So bring my black point down a little bit. And this seems like a pretty close match in terms of exposure. So now if I toggle this still on and off, it's subtle. Let me full screen this for you. But you can see there are differences subtle differences in the tonality between both images. So the black point is basically the same, the white point is basically the same, the exposure on her face is the same, but the transitions between those areas are all a little bit different. And this effect becomes more pronounced as you add more contrast. Now, whether or not these small changes in tonality are an issue is really up to you. I think the classic rule always applies, which is that if a shot looks good, then it is good, right? So if you're using different S-curves on different shots, but things still look good and your client's still happy, then at the end of the day, that's all that really matters. But I think regardless, it's always good to be educated about these things so that if it does become a problem, you know how to diagnose it and you know how to solve it. I also want to take this opportunity to quickly show you that linear contrast does not have this issue. So let me go ahead and reset my grade here. And in my project settings, I'm going to go ahead and switch my contrast control over to linear mode. So if I do the same thing as before, and I set my contrast to 1.3, and I'll set my pivot to 0.3, I'll go ahead and grab a still of that. And then I'll set my pivot to 0.6. And I want to match these two images. So I'll play that still. And literally all I have to do is move my offset until the exposure on her face is a match. And now we have basically an identical match, right? So I could even make another very, very slight adjustment there. And you can see if I play the still and I take it on and off, that these two images are literally identical. So this is one of the big advantages of using linear contrast and linear operations in general. We preserve the qualities of the original photography a bit better, and there isn't a risk of running into these little gotchas when it comes to things like tonality. And then of course, if this was a real workflow, at the end of this, you would probably have something to provide some kind of roll-off. So that could be an S-curve, or you could even just use like your soft clip tools here to provide a gentle roll-off in the highlights and shadows. And as long as you keep everything linear before that, then you basically get the best of both worlds, right? You get the consistency of linear contrast and using linear transforms, but then you get the nice roll-off of an S-curve, or in this case, your soft clip. And with that, we have finally reached the end. Hopefully this video was informative for you and you learned some new stuff about the contrast and pivot controls. If you'd like to stay up to date on new tutorials and personal projects, you can follow me on Instagram at Avery Peck Official. And in the meantime, I want to say thanks for watching. My name is Avery Peck, and I'll see you in the next one.